And welcome.
I'm Ann Dart.
I'm Tracy Stormy.
And I'm Kathy Knight.
And together we are
It Was a Dark and Stormy Book Club,
a podcast for mystery lovers.
Welcome.
If you enjoy our show, please consider contributing to the Dark and Stormy Patreon. By becoming a patron, you will help us create better and quality content. There are also benefits to becoming a patron, such as exclusive content and Dark and Stormy merchandise. Become a supporter at patreon.com/darkandstormybc. Check our website for the link. We appreciate any and all contributions. Thank you.
To the 90th episode of It Was a Dark and Stormy Book Club.
We don't look a day over 20.
I don't know. I feel about 95.
Hope everybody had a great Thanksgiving and didn't overeat.
Always do. Today, we have an interview with J.K. Franko. He is the author of the wonderful thriller Eye for Eye. J.K. Franko was born and raised in Texas at a time when what he really wanted to do in life, writing and film, were not considered legitimate jobs. His Cuban-American parents believed there were three acceptable career paths for a male: doctor, lawyer, or architect. After a disastrous first year of college pre-med, he ended up getting a BA in philosophy, not acceptable, and then he went to law school, salvaging the family name. Franko was on Law Journal. His work was cited by courts, and he was recognized as the National Law Journal's worth reading list, which for law is the equivalent of a top review in a New York Times. After 10 years as a lawyer, he decided that law and family life were not compatible. He went back to school where he got an MBA and later pursued a PhD, crossing the line from well-educated to overeducated. He left the law for corporate America with long stints working in Europe and Asia. It was his wife who pushed him to write novels. J.K. Franko now lives with his wife and children in South Florida with their 4 dogs and 1 cat.
Eye for Eye is J.K. Franko's debut novel, and it is the first in the Talion series. When I first met Susie, she appeared to be a normal, happily married woman dealing with tragedy. Then I uncovered her secrets. While I could understand everything that she'd done, I could never approve. But knowing what she was capable of, it became clear that if I was going to survive her, I had to play by her rules. And the first and most important rule is leave no singing bones.
We would like to introduce J.K. Franko, who is the author of the thrilling book Eye for Eye. Welcome, J.K.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
In your professional life, you were a lawyer from which you were able to glean personal experience to write Eye for Eye. Did you practice criminal law? And did anyone from your practice inspire any of your characters in the book?
That's a wonderful question. It's interesting because I did not practice criminal law as the main part of my practice, mostly civil law and commercial, although you deal with all sorts of people, obviously. There were times when some of my clients drifted from the civil and commercial into the criminal space without my prior knowledge or consent, obviously. So I did stumble into some very strange situations. I remember one time getting a call from the FBI because a client of mine had ended up in jail for, I think he was selling cocaine in a bank parking lot. And this was a guy, he was a legitimate business owner. He was doing real estate deals at the time. That's what I was representing him with. But I guess real estate wasn't covering all the bills, so he was making a little money on the side. So there were brushes with the criminal side of things inadvertently, for all of that legal experience. Even when I was that time interested in writing, there were characters, there were people, even law partners of mine, that were interesting as people. They were unusual. They had either some specific traits or just general ways of being that I thought were interesting as far as fiction. When you're writing a book, you draw on all of that kind of stuff. And I'd say if there's anyone in the first book of the series that draws from that background in terms of the personality rather than just the events and legal stuff that's kind of interwoven through the whole plot, it would probably be Roy. Roy. I think that there are some people in my past that I can think of specifically but won't name that do figure into his personality and into kind of like his career path as well, sort of because he starts out as a lawyer and then transitions into business. I think when you're writing, you draw on experience but also on personalities, and it helps to bring characters to life if you can visualize them. As a part of doing that, you just naturally draw on people that you know, people that you've met, that you think this person's kind of like X in this way, so I'm going to kind of imagine them that way and then layer additional behaviors or characteristics on top of them.
Interesting. What gave you the idea to keep the narrator unnamed until the very end of the book?
It's really kind of a funny story because when I first wrote the book, although there were hints at a narrator, there wasn't a narrator per se that was a part of the story. So I wrote the first draft, gave it to my wife to read, and she got to the end and she said, I like it. It's solid. The storyline's there. I see the arcs. It all comes together. There aren't any holes. But who's the narrator? Starts out with this person, really cool scene and kind of almost like a campfire story in the woods with this little girl. And then all of that comes back together at the end and it's cohesive. Person is speaking in the first person. Who is that? And she was right. Kind of put it in there because I felt like there were parts of the story that needed to be told in first person. But when I got to the end, I really didn't know who it was. And so I was kind of up in the air whether to make it Susie or Roy or make it somebody completely outside of the story or make it somebody that's in the story but that hasn't connected with it yet. And at the end of the day, spoiler alert, I went with the therapist angle, then went back through the whole book, that first version, kind of beefed up the first person and then wrote the epilogue where it's revealed who the narrator is. And then the narrator, obviously in books 2 and 3 that are coming out in the spring, the narrator is actually going to figure much more prominently in the book, actually participate in the event. So really it was sort of I wouldn't say it was an accident because there were first person's references. It came after the first draft. It wasn't something that was planned from the beginning.
Obviously, from the title of the book, Eye for Eye, this is a story, in essence, about revenge. So, where do you stand on the philosophical question, what would you do?
Yeah, I get asked that a lot at book clubs and then so forth. Part of the point of the book is to raise that question and to sort of lay out circumstances that, at least for the characters, make the act of revenge doable. I think in my mind's eye, if I was put in their same place, I think I would have no problem doing the same thing. Because what it comes down to is they've gone through the process of letting legal system do its work, weigh the evidence, the rights, and the whole process, and make a decision and mete out justice. And the legal system has failed, which is something that sometimes happens. I think it becomes more of a broader philosophical question that is, we've all entered into this somewhat tacit agreement that we're going to abide by these rules, and if the rules are broken, we have this system in place that will enforce the rules. And so what happens? What do you do if the legal system that's supposed to enforce those rules fails and very clearly fails? Do you just say, well, I was one of the X% outlier that didn't get justice and I'm just going to let it go? Or do you step in and say, okay, fine, I agreed to play by those rules, but those rules did not do what they're supposed to. Do I step in and correct that? And I think I would fall on the side of the correctors that would say, yeah, okay, I agreed, it didn't work, so now I'm going to take matters into my own hands and fix things.
I think that's very interesting because a lot of times when you hear a true story of something that happens, your first reaction, especially if it involves a child, is, oh, if that was my child, I would do X, Y, Z. You kind of gave everybody that revenge fantasy.
Yep, exactly. Exactly.
One of the best parts of your book, if you ask me, was your characters. Are any of those going to be in the next installment?
Absolutely. So the series, as it was originally planned and the current plan, is 3 books. A prequel that's going to be launched. When we launched Eye for Eye back in April in the UK, instead of doing the typical book signing, we put on a play, essentially. We rented a space in an old courthouse and we put on the trial of Joe Harlan, whose trial and acquittal is part of what sort of spurs all of the events in book 1. The play was really well received. Everyone really enjoyed it. And so what I did was I took the play, added some some prefatory chapters and a little bit after the trial and turned it into a prequel to the trilogy. So in that book, you'll get a little bit more exposure to Christy Wise, to Deb Wise, and Tom Wise. They're the primary characters in that prequel. And then in books 2 and 3, what you'll see more of, Susie and Roy will be back, as will Tom Wise, and we'll see much more of Christy in books 2 and 3 as well. So really, books 2 and 3 deal with the aftermath of book 1. At this point, we believe that Susie and Roy have gotten away with everything. Life is back to normal. But these things, when they happen, murders, have a long shelf life, so to speak. Although the clues and the evidence that's initially available may not enough to lead conclusion to an investigation or an indictment. People talk, things bubble to the surface, and so we will definitely be seeing more of them, and then a lot more of Christy and her dad as well in the last 2 books, along with Senator Harlan and Liz Barretto and the whole crew.
The whole gang will be back.
The whole gang, exactly.
Except for Deb.
Except for Deb. Deb's done, yes.
Yeah, Roy took care of Deb. Did you know about the link to the Game of Thrones when you wrote the book?
I did not. It's funny because when I first started writing the book, prologue came to me. I don't even remember where the idea came. I just loved whole ghost story in the woods kind of beginning. The first chapter I wrote while we were actually up in Colorado at Beaver Creek, and that came very naturally as well. The story in the series really is all about revenge. I wanted to introduce that concept very early and sort of foreshadow everything beyond the obvious reference in the title. And so I was trying to find a relatively current reference people could connect with that was a revenge kind of reference. We were watching Game of Thrones behind everybody else. We weren't watching them as they came out. And I'd read all the books. And so when I saw the end of season 6 again, the scene and the extreme nature of the revenge that Arya took was something that just clicked for me. In the first drafts of the book, the reference was much, much longer, and all my editors, most of them wanted me to take it out completely. I didn't want to because I needed something. It was either that or the Count of Monte Cristo, but I felt like that was much too dated a reference. So I wove that in to basically foreshadow where everything was going very early on.
It did the trick.
Wonderful. I'm glad to hear that.
You mentioned the prequel before putting out Tooth for Tooth, the second book. We noticed that you are simultaneously running a play on your website for the prequel. How did that come to be? That's very interesting.
It was not entirely planned. When we launched the book in the UK and we put on the play for the opening, I hired a film crew to film it. And I didn't know what exactly I was going to use it for because it was unusual. So most book openings are stale cheese and crackers and author reads a chapter and wine and plastic cups, and that's it. Mainly my fear of reading in public is what drove me to write a play and then act in it, which that didn't turn out as planned. We decided to film it. Then because it was so well received, I wrote the prequel and we already had all of the footage. So we decided to basically edit it. So one of the things that you'll see, I'll send you guys a copy of the prequel once we're off the podcast. In the prequel, there are several chapters in advance of the trial, and then there's the trial, and then there are a few chapters after the trial. Get introduced to the characters, the trial occurs, and then we see their reaction setting up the series. And I do, in the book, in the prequel, refer the readers out to the video. So rather than reading the transcript of the trial, and it's written in a similar format to the interviews in Eye for Eye toward the end in the investigation, it's basically written in kind of court reporter transcript style. Rather than reading it, you can actually go out and view the videos and then come back to the book. And so it becomes a much more interactive sort of multimedia experience, sort of are introduced to the events that lead to the trial. Then you can go online, watch it, like watching I think we've broken it into 6 chapters or episodes, and then go back to the book and finish it. So it's kind of a different sort of experience for the reader. An additional fun thing we did for the audio version of the prequel, I read it myself, so I'm actually the narrator. And we got the same actors to come back into studio and play all the parts. So when you get to the transcript of the trial on the audible version, it'll be sort of like an old-time radio show where it cuts to the trial. It'll be spoken, acted out by the different voices, including myself as the judge, and then it comes back to the book in narration. So we're just trying to play with the medium a little bit. We already had the footage from the play. Things just kind of evolved from that.
Well, that really is a brilliant idea because when I read the book, it talks about Joe Harlan Jr. Jr. and his father and what happened, but it doesn't really go into that many details about what actually occurred, except that a rape occurred and he got away with it in the courts. That's a brilliant idea. It'll answer a lot of questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
It also sounds like it was a lot of fun.
It was a blast. It was very nerve-wracking for me because I thought I wanted to become a writer because I like locking myself in a room with